Well, thank you very much, Diana. What an introduction. I've forgotten I did everything in my little humble life. Wow. Well, really, it feels like I'm in family here, and it's really great to see so many people I know, and so many people actually I don't know, which means there's new blood in this organization. So exciting, and very daunting task to follow Taryn. Excellent presentation, but also it's a great thing that I'm following Taryn because Taryn was talking about very difficult circumstances, those where there's humanitarian crises. The issues that I want to deal with are now outside those humanitarian crises. So supposedly in environments that are easier for us to control, supposedly, and where we could make a difference. So I don't know, Gurmit is here to share the PowerPoint. I'd like to start the presentation right away. Next slide. And what we're going to be doing is really a very short presentation of why we're talking about economic opportunity for all. Then we'll move immediately to a few minutes in breakout rooms. Why breakout rooms? It's because I'd like you to share your experience of dealing with the pandemic to make it real. Because when we talk about money, economic opportunity, economic development, it gets the impression quite quickly we're talking about abstractions, money, GDP, income. No, it is real life experience with anxiety, with a sense of exhilaration when life works, and all these kinds of things. So basically we need to root it in reality because that's how it happens in the field. Then we'll talk about really what's needed to generate incomes and what the various ways are, what the possible solutions are. And we'll focus especially on a few recent good news that you may not be aware of. We will talk about challenges because we're not just here to try to blow sunshine in your vision, but rather know what the challenges are and then try to identify a few next steps. So without further ado, next slide, please, Gurmit. I call this the game plan. We're all in the business of ending extreme poverty. Well, there is, if we take now a really distant view, we look at it and it's a three-legged stool. That is our approach to ending extreme poverty. We need health. If somebody's unhealthy, their kids are unhealthy, they can't hold a steady job, and things are never going to work out. Education. If you or your kids are not educated, things are never going to work out. But here's the deal. And we spend most of our times on the first two legs of the stool. You can be perfectly healthy, quite well educated. Perhaps you finished your secondary education, perhaps even, I don't know, a few years of post-secondary. But if there is no economic opportunity, there is just no way you can actually make things work for your family. We are here to talk about the third leg of the stool. So move on to the next slide, please. We're going to start with a very quick way of bringing, if you want, the experience of what it is to look for economic opportunity. But we'll make it totally real. And we're going to make it real because we're now all in a pandemic context. So what was your own experience of having to deal with this pandemic context and the lockdown that ensued? All this, of course, in a resource-rich country. And now try to project yourself in Africa. We just chose Africa. What can you imagine your key challenges? We're not going to ask you to imagine what it is for an African, but imagine you just transplanted, it's you. How would you react based on that? What will be your concerns? Just try to keep those present. And then your mission, it will be in groups of 4. We'll try to do it just in 8 minutes or less. So it's 2 minutes maximum per person, back and forth, of course. The idea is to come up with what would be the 2 key ideas for you that would summarize what would be your challenges. Everyone's going to have a different reaction to this. What would be yours? And we'll just put it in the chat and then we'll continue. Okay, so breaking into those breakout rooms, and we'll come back quickly, ready to share. Dermot, have you put people in hello?
Hello.
Yeah. Am I in the group? I can't see.
You also want to go in a room?
Yeah, let me be in the room if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Maybe we returned too soon.
How is your partner, Karen? Is he doing well?
Yes, we both are fully vaccinated and both did not get sick. Our son-in-law did contract the virus, but he wasn't at his home at the time. He was in Arizona, so he didn't bring it home with him. And now our kids in Seattle are both vaccinated. Oh, I see. We went too soon. I thought it said we had to go, but it says closing in 2 minutes, so we're okay. Yeah. No, how about you? Have you had anybody close been in the situation with the virus?
Well, there's our daughter, her family, they've gotten vaccinated, and they have children that have had to stay home, out of school. So that's been quite a bit of disruption. And I hope their kids have kept up with their lessons and everything adequately. Some kids seem to do fine, and others are like, are hard to push.
Yeah, I think it's hard on everybody, and we have all kinds of resources to help. So,
have you had any meetings with what's your contact with your legislators?
Yeah, we had virtual meetings.
Yeah. So have you met
and in
with?
fact, we were going to meet with Adam Smith's aides, and Adam Smith himself came on and said, "No, you're meeting with me."
Oh, that's wonderful! Wow, that's very lucky. And what about what about Patty Murray? Have you met with her?
We've met with both Murray and Cantwell's aides on multiple occasions. Yeah.
Oh, good. So do you have separate meetings with the domestic housing issues and then another meeting?
No, just different. We had meetings with the regional offices as well as the main office.
Well, I'm sure they're both champions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's easy. Well, that's great.
Looks like everybody's coming back.
Going to change slides, please. And don't forget just to put your 2 words, what was the key thing that struck you about what your concern would be. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit of how the COVID situation has sort of played out in the developing world. First of all, 2 types of consequences, obviously. There is increased morbidity and increased mortality. So people are sick, people are dying, obviously. But in many countries, including in Africa specifically, there's not too much of that. But there's a secondary effect, and that's the disruptions in the activities of the institutions like schools, departments, agencies, bus companies, and the private sector, even just like companies that operate normally, well, they're not operating anymore. And what that has led to is that if you look at the rapid surveys that were done, 60% of the households that were living already in low or very low income settings, 60% of the households saw their incomes reduced. And the reduction of income for those households was 60%. So imagine you're earning $2 a day, and all of a sudden it's reduced by 60%. So you're left with 80 cents per day. That's very, very difficult. It means that harvests are affected. It means that because people don't have enough money to buy seeds or fertilizers, or there's just no supply available for them anymore in those areas. in urban areas, incomes are insufficient to buy food. That translates by what? Number of people going in a situation where 150 million people in extreme poverty now are, people who were not in extreme poverty are now in extreme poverty. So that's an increase, if you want, in the number of poor on the planet. But if you look at those that are experiencing food insecurity, that number has doubled to 265 million. So these are huge, huge concerns. And if you just look at one element of the rapid surveys, which are just basically surveys that are done periodically, and what we saw just in 2020 is that in countries in Africa, which is, Africa is not, of course, a very, how do you put it, homogenous set of countries. It's got different realities, but the realities that we saw in terms of people, for instance, having had to skip eating during a full day because they didn't have enough money to buy food, well, that proportion of people range from 10% in some countries. So 1 in 10 had in the previous month to skip eating altogether for a day, to 30%. And in some cases, some extreme cases, 60% of the population had to at least spend a day without eating. So that is a very, very difficult situation. Next slide, please. So in no particular order, just to throw out what it looks like, the schools are not open. You can't leave your children there. Border closures mean there's fewer supplies, no exports, so that affects you one way or another. There's less economic activities. If you had a little business or you were employed by a little business, there's fewer clients, and just there's fewer opportunities to earn income. So two solutions to that, or at least two elements to a solution. You have to both curb the pandemic. We'll never improve the economic situation in low-income countries if we can't curb the pandemic. So it's not just for matters of health, but it's matters of economic activity. People don't trust the economy enough to invest their time and money if the pandemic is not curbed. But also, in the meantime, we need to ensure the poorest households receive the support they require to have access to more disposable income. Next slide, please. So what sort of avenues do we have to support, I was going to say income generation. It's not so much generations, access to income, we're going to call it. Because the first one is not really about generating, it's social assistance, and it's just about having transfers of money to those who have nothing to eat. Well, believe it or not, there are already social assistance schemes in the poorest countries, including countries in Africa, many of them, the majority of them, and they're supporting families in the forms of either cash transfers or in-kind donations. Perhaps it's a bag of maize, for instance. So there's maize meal they can actually make for the family. But in low-income countries, the average transfer to a poor family is only $4. It's a $4 that makes a difference, of course, undoubtedly, but you can't go very far. So you have to really move up the ladder. The next avenue is available that will help generate, if you want, the income required, is helping microenterprises. Why is that? It's because in the global south, the reality is that the source of income for 70% of the population, but in most cases, it's actually 85% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. Where they find their income is in microenterprises. So it is crucial that we help microenterprises, because that's how we reach the poorest 85% sub-Saharan Africa, poorest 70% generally speaking. And in this informal economy that sort of permeates low-income countries, we need to foster either the growth or the emergence of microenterprises. And I saw that my friend Anita had a question. The 4% is normally a month, but it's not guaranteed that every month there will be a transfer. So there you go. It could be less frequent. Next slide, please. So one of the avenues that people are often familiar with is microfinance institutions. Results has worked in the past with the Microcredit Summit, and microfinance institutions do a very important work. I mean, they provide the fuel for microenterprise development, which is funding for supplies and funding for assets. You can't start a little business if you can't do that. If you can't buy your raw materials, if you can't basically buy the little machine that you may need to husk rice or whatever it is that you're doing. So Grameen Bank is, of course, one of the ones that we think of, and we have been closely associated with Dr. Mohammed Yunus in that area, but there are many other organizations I put here, Action, Kiva, and there's many others. In Canada, you have Développement International Desjardins, you would have Soko Devi, MEDA, so many partners in that area. Next slide, please. What we've found, though, is that what really works, and people like Grameen Bank will tell you that, if you have microfinance is great, but really what matters is if you have accompaniment. So you have group meetings, you have coaching, you have technical training, you have support perhaps to help you, a little stipend to help you feed your family. That really makes a big, big difference. So programs that include all this suite of programs are called graduation programs. So basically they have a transfer of asset or funding for supplies. Perhaps it's a form of a loan, but more often it's a grant. These graduation programs are very impactful, and they have demonstrated their, how could I put it, their ability to generate impact in the lives of the poorest through randomized controlled trials. We'll get to that a bit later in the presentation, but these are programs that have been pioneered by BRAC USA, BRAC and BRAC USA later, BRAC being a Bangladeshi NGO who started targeting the very poor, the ultra poor, and as we'll see later, the results are spectacular. I want to go to the next slide to talk a little bit about economic inclusion. Now, economic inclusion is, if you want, graduation plus. In other words, it's all the graduation approaches that includes also the microfinance and all bundled interventions. So just not the ones that focus on one thing, like, for instance, you know, transferring an asset, giving a go, you know, going for access to finance, access to assets, access to coaching, access to technical assistance. And these economic inclusion programs also include cash for work schemes. So that's the general bundled approach. Really important because it's shown to make a difference. Next slide, please. So let me get to those good news that I was alluding to just a minute ago. The economic inclusion programs work. I want to repeat that. I feel compelled like 5 times, but really let's rather focus on what that really means. It means that here we're talking specifically about programs that were pioneered by BRAC, graduation programs, but not only those, mainly those. And what these programs did from the very beginning is test their clientele's outcomes compared to control groups that did not have access to the programs. and they just compared how both cohorts were doing. And what they saw is that those who had taken economic inclusion programs, had participated in them, had better income and revenue, they had better assets, they had better consumption, they had better savings. Now, not all of them had shown results on those four fronts. Some of them, typically it's on two fronts, so might be income and savings or consumption and assets, but it's really important to see that there is undisputable impact. I want to mention how many studies there are right now to back this. This is not about 3, 5, or 18 studies. We're talking over 90 studies, 90. And here it's, you see, for instance, that in income and revenue, there was a total of 68 studies. 51 of them showed a significant positive impact on income and revenue. 17 showed that the impact was negligible, basically. None of them ever showed that there was a negative impact. So it's always positive or negligible. And you can see it's always on the side of significant. So this really is important. I'm going to say one last word because I know the time is going. I should stop speaking soon. But one thing that is important to note is when we say that these programs work, the emphasis here, these programs are not permanent programs. They last from 18 months to 3 years. That's the typical design. After that, there is not one red cent. There is not one coaching program. There's no one technical training session. Again, but we still keep on looking at what's happening to those households that participate in the programs. And even 7 years later, you can see that there is an impact. And the impact is increasing over time, even when the intervention is stopped. So these are really good news. I'm going to go to the next slide now. The second thing is now there is a very strong base of expertise and advocacy. So there is what's called the Partnership for Economic Inclusion, which is a partnership that receives support from big foundations and also from a few governments and key NGOs. Results is represented, and they are, if you want, the nexus for all the information. They publish a State of Economic Inclusion report that's like 300 pages. It reviews more than 200 programs reaching 90 million people. So there is a huge amount of knowledge of what works, what didn't work, and how to basically follow best practices. And they're even starting to look at how much you should invest per capita per various types of expenditures like technical training or coaching and things like that. So it is a very, very practical and extremely rigorous database that is available now. Moving on, please. Next slide. So what I call now the still better news. So the first thing is that economic inclusion programs are reaching the poorest at last. So you know that results has always tried to focus on the poorest, those in extreme poverty. And it's always difficult because there is a temptation to, well, do the easier thing, go for the low-hanging fruit, as they call it, etc. Well, right now, these programs are essentially reaching 50 million people. That includes their family members in extreme poverty. So this is not anecdotal. 50 million people are being reached by these programs that were just a few years ago prototypes. And what is really encouraging is that within those 50 million, we have the ultra poor. So those among the extreme poor that are the worst off because they don't have economic wherewithal, but they also have low educational levels and often not access to a lot of health care also. So we have 50 million being reached. Given these, I remind you, are time limited programs, well, we'll be able to start some more programs with the same budget in 2023 for another 2 to 3 years, and others in 2027 for another 2 or 3 years. So that means we could go up to 150 million people reach by the year 2030. That's over, if you want, a big proportion of the 700 million people that are in extreme poverty, 150 million. And that does not include any additional impact that could be had should we try to insist in our governments increasing their funding for economic inclusion programs, or we insist on the programs being more focused on the extreme poor. We could reach as many as 40% potentially of the population living in extreme poverty by 2030 with those effective and proven programs. So that is indeed quite exciting. Now, next slide. We have to be mindful of challenges though. This post-pandemic period is characterized by high government indebtedness, and that is the donor governments like Canada, huge amount of debt, the U.S., the U.K., you name it, but also countries of the South themselves are very highly indebted. That's not the easiest for increasing a focus on a given program. In addition, at this moment, you can imagine the schools were shut, the health facilities were shut, et cetera. So there's a lot of priorities other than economic inclusion programs. So that's also an important challenge to face. And finally, just a word to say that there is a global fund against AIDS, TB, and malaria. There's a global fund for immunization, but there's no economic opportunity or economic inclusion fund yet. So there's nothing that centralizes our ask. We could just say to our government, please write a check too. It's still very fragmented out there. So next slide. What are the next steps? Well, obviously, we need to get our politicians, interested in this issue. We need to continue building the evidence base because that is something that's really, if you want, a plus of those economic inclusion programs. We need to make sure also countries with low incomes insist that in their relationship with donors, economic inclusion programs be prioritized. So demand must come from them. And finally, there's something that I'm inviting each of us to do, which is joining the Partnership for Economic Inclusion learning event at the end of this month. So you can find out more about the most recent impact studies, the most recent best practices in the sector, what potentially the outreach might be in the coming years, all this. So next slide. Basically, this is the conference I'm talking about, and I think they'll put it in the chat, but please go to peiglobal.org. You'll find where to register. These are 3 mornings. And of course, for those of you in Pacific time zone who, of course, would be challenged by this kind of time, of course, you can take the conferences later in the day. So that's it for me in terms of presentation. Please stop the screen sharing so I can see people, and we can take a few questions perhaps.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Tardif, for that wonderful presentation. I personally really enjoyed that how you included the better news and still even better news. They were amazing. So now for the questions, please put them in the chat box, which will be monitored by Jaya and I'll be the ones who will be reading the questions. Okay.
Just one thing, Roger was pointing out the fact that FINCA should, of course, be mentioned. And of course, FINCA should be mentioned. They are very important microfinance organizations and definitely part of the solution. Absolutely.
Yes, I already see some questions in the chat from Jaya. How can we build these programs into more of the development aid supported by the government?
I'm going to actually take advantage of the fact that I think the question is ambiguous to give two answers. So actually, we want development aid to be supported by governments of donor countries. And we want economic inclusion to be also supported by governments of implementing countries. And I think, by the way, I give two answers, but it's really part of the same answer. We need to make sure, as I was saying, that there is demand from countries of the South. What is very, very encouraging, beyond anything I had anticipated or even dreamt of, is the fact that very poor countries have taken the really unprecedented step to build social assistance programs to reach populations that were very, very vulnerable during this pandemic, to transfer them funds. And I'm telling you, sometimes it was only $4 at a time, but it made a huge difference. It means that these people now, the governments of the South, I'm calling out the South, of the low-income countries, they know how to reach vulnerable populations. They've done it once. Now they know they could possibly start a graduation program, an economic inclusion program. They know where to find those people. And so that is already, if you want, a large part of the implementation work has been done. But we need to also encourage our own governments in their relationships with countries in low-income settings to make sure that this is part of the conversation. And we need to also make sure that the institutions that are the ones that are, if you want, setting the trends in the financial area, economic development area, especially the World Bank, have this as their priority. The Partnership for Economic Inclusion is housed at the World Bank, and I think a little bit of tender support and advocacy from results could go a long way.
Another question is, what are the dates of the PEI learning event?
So 27th, 28th, and 29th of April.
Okay. And another question from Jaya is, given high donor indebtedness, do private programs such as KIA work as effectively? What are alternative potential ways to fund these programs?
The truth is, the crisis has hurt everybody. And I think at this stage, we need to have all hands on deck. And I'm very, very happy to say that if you look at those 90 million people being reached by economic inclusion programs, they are mostly reached by governments of implementing countries, so low-income country governments. But those governments are operating in partnership with non-governmental organizations. So it looks like an alliance is developing between governments and non-governmental organizations to make sure that there is proper delivery and delivery at scale of the economic inclusion packages. So that means, for all intents and purposes, private programs and public programs are going hand in hand, and I think they should continue, at least in short term, because that has proven to really to be very, very fruitful cooperation.
We have some time for a last question. Is there an issue with transfer being utilized for political/electoral benefits of government/elites?
Is there an issue? The answer is yes, sir, there is. Okay, meaning an issue being a potential issue. Yes, there is. That's why it's important that these programs are programs that are based on impact. So in other words, you cannot do what you did in Mexico a few years ago, whereas you would go and provide funding for families if they did this, this, and that, which involved generally supporting the local people in power, etc. Why it really matters is you want to be able to always track the actual results. In other words, has the income of the household increased? Has their savings increased? And that has to be an independent assessment. And I think that's what, if you limits, if you want, the political, how could I put it, overtones that might take over the program.
Okay. I think that would be it for today. Again, thank you so much, Mr. Tardif, for a marvelous presentation. It was very insightful and enjoyable.